Welcome, everybody, to this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. My name is Jeff Thomas, and we've got a very special guest with us today, Cale Dowell, the president of Arcos Global Advisors. Say hello to the people, Cale.
Howdy.
And this is really part two in a three-part webinar series that we came up with as a follow-up to an event that Generous Business Owner did for Hope International, where we interviewed some of their givers and then promised to do these three webinars as a follow-up around kingdom estate planning. And before you hit stop on your recording about a boring topic, we think it's going to be fun. We're going to tell a lot of stories and this sort of thing. We've got a framework that we want to kind of take you through, kingdom versus world estate planning, and just sort of tell stories about the difference. And then three questions that we ask. And Cale, why don't you talk about the three questions we're going to talk about on this series, and then maybe hone in on the one we're going to focus on today.
That's right. Yes. So the three questions that we think every family at some point has to ask, and you're seeing those on the screen now if you're watching, is how much is enough for us? How much is enough for the kids? And what do I do with the rest? So last time we kind of honed in on how much is enough for us, but today we're going to focus in on how much is enough for the kids. And man, is that a loaded question. Jeff, how do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, Cale, the reason we're having you on there is, we've been dealing with these families together at Arcos for a long time. And don't you think this is the number one question we get
By
is,
by
yeah,
far.
what do we do about the kids?
Now, it doesn't always come out that way, right? But it's the question behind the hand, is what I like to say.
Exactly. So if you are listening to this on a podcast, maybe pull it up on YouTube. We've got some slides. And if you didn't hear part one of how much is enough for us, basically the patriarch and matriarch, go back and search in the podcast for that one or on YouTube. And so anyway, and then we'll do number three shortly. So anyway, let's go to this framework. We always like to start with this sort of kingdom versus estate framework. Cale, if you take us to that, let's go to the next page. One of the things we try to do, and we call this at Arcos kind of a whiteboard session, where we really just have families come in, generous business owners come in, and they have some kind of need, tactical need. Should I do a DAF or a foundation? Some question like this. And then we always try to back up, hear the narrative, and then get a framework like how have they done the estate planning. And we found it amazing how many people who are really generous, often believers, who all have the same kind of template for estate planning. And even well-intentioned estate planners tend to jam everybody into this template, which is essentially take your total net worth, divide by the number of kids and grandkids you have, discount and jam it in to trusts. And what, as you can see, if you're looking at this on YouTube, there's about 30 million you can pass to the next generation without tax. The remaining is taxable, and there's 40+% tax on that amount. So in this sort of simple version, if 30 million can pass to the family without tax, and there's another 70 million that doesn't, you're going to pay a big tax bill on that, about 30 million bucks. And often what gets done is an insurance policy gets bought to pay the estate tax. And at the end of the day, the result is that pretty much everything goes to the kids. You pay the estate tax with the insurance, but everything goes to the kids. And maybe there's a little tip to your favorite nonprofits, your church, and a couple of nonprofits. Cale, how would you reframe that? What I missed there?
Yeah, I think it's important. A couple things just to note is, so we tend to call this kind of the world's estate plan. There's obviously, different flavors of this, but it all nets the same place, which is dump,
Right.
divide, dissipate. I mean, how do I get the assets off my balance sheet and get it into the hands of the next generation as tax efficiently as possible? And quite frankly, you can see that this template achieves that result. Now, oftentimes one of the things that does get communicated, you ask someone like, oh, well, how, have you solved the estate? What are you paying to the IRS? Oh, well, I'm paying nothing is usually the response. Well, that's
Exactly.
that's a little bit of a misnomer because while maybe you're not directly paying the IRS is still getting paid in this scenario, right? It's to the tune of about 30 million bucks. It's just in the form of an insurance company making that payment on your behalf. Um, which, by the way, Jeff, that comes with a cost to it. I mean, what do you think the cost is on a
Oh,
policy like that?
depending on the age and health of
Yeah,
the people buying it, usually you're not, 40 when you're doing that. Usually you're, in 60s or 70s doing
sure.
that, which is a lot more expensive. So, I mean, we've seen premiums up to, half a million bucks a year.
Yeah,
Uh, so,
it, it's
a lot of
pricey.
money going out the door with maybe not the correct objectives. And so, look,
Yeah,
there's nothing wrong with this if
for
this is
sure.
what God tells you to do, but we just think it's overused and not very well thought out and customized, where you're kind of, frankly, the tax tail
There you
is
go. Yeah,
wagging the dog, right?
absolutely. And that's what we see time and time again is with good intention, people kind of establish the traditional estate plan, and it's very focused on mitigating taxes, which hey, we're all for that. But in the pursuit of tax mitigation, sometimes what happens to these families is the calling or the purpose gets lost, or maybe doesn't get addressed at all. And it once this type of framework, this type of estate plan is kind of set in stone. Depending on how it's done, can be very hard to change or unwind. And so we've seen people navigate that with a lot of pain in some cases, trying to figure out what to do once this has been done, because maybe it's not actually the right structure to fuel the calling that they feel like has been placed on their lives. So,
Well,
Jeff,
and we kind of went through this last time, and so probably each time we do this in this three-part webinar series, maybe we'll spend a little less time on this because you've maybe heard it before, but I think
yep,
it still bears repeating as a framework, just to kind of identify this. Yeah. So thanks for going to this next one. So again, we're showing a slide. If you can go to YouTube to see it eventually, but we'll describe it if you're just listening to this. We call this kind of the Kingdom Estate Plan, and the reason we're showing this first is this gets to more of a custom plan where after you've asked these three questions that we're focusing on, we think 99% of the time you're going to get something a little more creative than the template. Okay. And we're not trying to prescribe what that is, but we are trying to prescribe three questions where if you believe you're a steward, not an owner, that you ask God, who's the owner, which is how much enough for us? How much enough for the kids? And what do we do with the rest? And those are, easy to rattle off, hard to answer without a lot of time, maybe with your spouse if you're married, and asking the owner God to do. And of course, we think it's helpful to hear other stories. So we're going to share a bunch of stories today on especially question number two. But just to kind of walk through this quickly on a kingdom plan. Again, one thing we just kind of do this on a whiteboard for people a lot. Thought it'd be helpful maybe to run through it in a webinar where again about 30 million can go tax free to whomever, let's say your family, and then the remaining again around that 70 million, there's still tax due on that, but there's not tax due on that if you leave it to charity, okay? And or even if you give it while you're alive. So let's say your answer to these three questions: how much enough for you? You've got $100 million estate. How much enough for you? 30 million bucks. You say that you come to that conclusion, okay? And how much enough for the kids? 30 million. Again, we're not trying to prescribe that, but just for easy illustration, that's the case. So you got enough. Let's say you got three kids, they each get 10. What do you do with the rest, the other 70? One of the things we talk about is, give it while you're living so you're knowing where it's going. So, Cale, why don't you kind of jump off of that? What are the benefits of that? How do we avoid the tax altogether, that sort of thing? Where does all the money end up going?
yeah. So obviously in this scenario, and again, without prescription, those numbers may or may not that Jeff rattled out may or not be right for you.
Right.
But the idea here is if something like that feels more palatable, feels more like what God's calling you to, it enables you to rethink the let's call it the excess. The what do I do with the rest? So if you can actually answer those first two questions, and we'll talk about this in the next series, which is what do I do with the rest? But what tends to happen is obviously a charitable giving, which generally in most estate plans is kind of like the last question. It's like, oh, by the way, do you want to tip anything, to charity? This becomes a more of a conducive function of the estate plan. And charitable that form of generosity can take shape in lots of different ways and shapes. But effectively, this does what one of our principles that we espouse is disinherit the IRS. This disinherits the IRS at the end of the day. So it enables you to use what would other be taxable dollars and transform those dollars into charitable dollars in a way that, in many cases, for a lot of the families that we've encountered that have navigated some version of this, experience much more joy in doing, and it's something that they take part in today, not just as a well, when we pass, we'll leave this giant sum of money, which by the way is an option, but it's something that they find a lot of joy in participating in today, doing both with their spouse, but also bringing family members into the fold. So kids and grandkids into that journey of generosity and empowering them and equipping them on navigating that type of heritage of as a family we are generous and generosity looks like this. So it's a really powerful tool and a powerful conversation that we hope unlocks in your heart or in mind the idea that what's right for us might not necessarily be what everyone else is doing, but some custom template that enables us to pursue the calling that God's placed on our lives.
And I'm glad you brought up the fact that we're using $100 million example. We know that's a high number for most of the population. We're just using it as kind of an extreme example to show, that it really doesn't matter if it's that number or not. Any number that's above what you need or you want to give to the kids, think about what that excess is. So again, back to those three questions. How much enough for you? How much enough for the kids? If there's a delta, what do you do with the delta? It's still relevant even if there's not a state tax. If there is, man, it's such a, I mean, why pay 30 plus million bucks or something close to it to the government if you don't have to? Or it might be bigger in your case or smaller. But either way, you get the joy of giving maybe while you're alive. That's something that we see a lot of our clients doing, but we don't see that in the general population much. And there's some angst. We see a lot of people come in, they're not comfortable with this world's plan that they have, but they don't know what else to do. So part of what we're trying to do is kind of normalize these stories and give you some ideas about how other people have dealt with this. So us go to the next and okay. So and just to summarize that last bit, zero goes to insurance company. There you go. Why don't you just walk them through this real quick, Cale? The
Yeah, so
conclusion.
so in this two kind of extreme models, I like to think of them kind of as bookends. In the traditional model, it's all about how do I get the full amount. So in this case, $100 million to the kids. The IRS is still getting their approximately 30 million. It's just now paid by an insurance company. You've got a big insurance premium that you're paying year to year, and your charitable giving is zero or probably minimal in the grand scheme of things. In this other kind of kingdom model, you in this case, the scenario, you decided 30 million was enough for the kids. So you got three kids, divide by three, or one of the things we talk about a lot is we'll talk about it maybe a little bit today is you can love them equally but treat them uniquely. But 30 million is enough for the kids. The IRS gets zero in this case. Insurance company gets zero in this case. There's no premiums, and of course your charitable giving goes absolutely through the roof. And we'll share some stories about some folks that have navigated variations of that today. But that maybe takes us to the question of today, which is how much is enough for the kids? Jeff, I know we've got it on the screen here, but how else would you translate that question?
Well, you know my favorite way to say it is what my favorite line is. How do you give the kids a leg up, but not two legs up on the couch? That's my favorite line about this, because when you have these resources of no matter how many zeros are involved, of course you love your kids. You want them to do maybe better than you did. Well, what does better mean? You want it to be a tailwind, like any resources you have to be a tailwind for their purpose, not a headwind. And I think everybody's sort of familiar with these stories where, it can be a headwind if not handled properly. Okay, well then how do you handle it? And it's really just not a one size fits all problem, is it, Cale?
No, and obviously, the mission here at Arcos is to help families connect their money with their purpose. We think that money is just a tool, a resource, but when it's got the right purpose behind it, it can be very useful into things that, quite frankly, have, in our opinion, greater impact. So how do we one of the things you've talked about, Jeff, is being a pipeline, not a barn, or not just building bigger barns, but being a pipeline is a conduit.
Pipeline, not a storage tank in our Texas oil talk.
Better way to say it. But the one leg up, but not two legs up on the couch. I mean, I literally used that phrase this morning with a family that's navigating the same issue. And it comes to fruition. Everyone's at a different place in trying to navigate this question. This morning, I think the family I was chatting with, they've arrived at the number, but they've yet to figure out how they want to communicate that.
Right.
So that's kind of where we're at right now. But Jeff, from your standpoint, like what are some examples, or do you have any stories on how different families have navigated this question, either positively or negatively, and what the result was?
Well, you know, we we talk about this. Kayla and I talk about this every day in what we do for a living, and so we have so many stories. And then from the podcast, the Generous Business Owner podcast, is we just keep getting more and more stories. And I think our issue here, Kale, is limiting the number of stories we tell. But we just took a group of generous business owners to Oklahoma City to meet the Greens, who David Green was interviewed and started Hobby Lobby, and it's such an interesting story about he did it. One of the things I love about that
Yeah.
is this spoke right into kind of our framework. Years ago, he did exactly. He had Christian estate planning attorneys, but they guided him to the template that we just showed you, the world's template. And he did this. He's sitting on his porch the Saturday after that week where he had signed all the documents, creating all these trusts and discounting the shares of Hobby Lobby, or interest to kids and grandkids. And he was having his quiet time, and he felt like God saying, I own the tree. You gave away the tree. You're supposed to just eat the fruit.
Hmm.
And David started weeping, the founder of Hobby Lobby, and he, sort of cried out, "What am I supposed to do?" And so what he got from that was, you got to take it back. And so he went back and basically had all the kids and grandkids sign documents that said they wouldn't take the money. And we can get into the technicalities of that. I think technically those are probably irrevocable and this sort of thing. And we're actually going to have eventually, hopefully, the Hobby Lobby lawyer on to talk even more about the specifics of that. But suffice it to say, before the money started flowing, which I think is an important fact,
Qualifier. Yeah.
we give them credit for the worldview and the being able to give it back. They didn't have to, but they all signed to give it back, and they had to kind of redo the direction. So now half the profits go to charity. But on the other side of that, maybe you can tell, our one of our co-founders of the generous business owner movement, Alan Barnhart's story. Maybe that's a good place to start on the alternative side where you don't have to
Well,
redo it.
Well, and Alan's story is so unique, and for anyone listening that's ever been to a generous giving or a journey of generosity, it's an incredible radical story that inspires I think anyone and everyone that hears it. So simplistically, Alan, when he was much younger, in his 20s, his parents had a little crane company, one crane, in Tennessee, and Alan really wanted to be a missionary, but decided, with his brother, well, mom and dad, they were trying to, not get rid of the crane company, but pass it on to the kids, and they felt kind of a sense of obligation that I guess we got to take this on for mom and dad. So off they go, but Alan really wanted, in his heart of hearts, wanted to be a missionary. So early on, he had set for himself kind of a finish line, a financial finish line, and opted to pay himself no more than X dollars. Well, as so often happens, people we've talked to that once they establish kind of a commitment of some form of generosity to the Lord, woo, does the balance sheet start to grow. And that's what happened with Alan, specifically in the business. That crane company has really taken off, and he's kind of kept himself at that level, that finish line that he started at, and the company has produced incredible profits. They've actually given away 99% of the equity, the non-voting equity of that business, and they just keep the one control share. So it's enabled them to give away in immeasurable amount of dollars each year, using the business as kind of the conduit of that profits of the business, the conduit for that significant generosity. But also, I mean, an incredible sacrifice on his part. He didn't have to do that, but the way he would tell the story is not as a prescription that anyone should do what he did, but he prayed, he asked God. That's what the Lord told him to do, and he's been faithful following in that path, and it's created a significant impact in the world. Just their generosity as a family, and along the way, he's been able to get the kids and grandkids involved, and he had to ask himself, even though this question is how much is enough for the kids, and so he came to his own conclusion on what that was going to look like for their family, but it was different, or maybe a different conversation than a family that had on their personal balance sheet a much larger number, because Alan had already given that away. Changed the conversation a little bit. Anything you would add to that, Jeff?
And to just customize this a little bit to this question we're dealing with today about how does this Green story and the Barnhart story impact the kids? I think what's so interesting is, both of these are business owners. Okay, in Alan's story, he always says that, people say, well, what do the kids think about it? We actually did a podcast on this. Go back to one of the very first ones. It might have been even episode 2, where we interviewed Alan and asked him, what do the kids think about this? And he said, well, I didn't ask them. It's my job as the steward and their parent to do the best thing I can do. He goes, I feel like by setting my own finish line, I've protected myself from greed. And I feel like setting a finish line for my kids also protects them from greed. So he thinks too much money can be a risk factor to separate you from putting God first, which I think is absolutely biblical. But the word he uses all the time is protection. That is his personal conviction. He feels protected, and he feels like his kids are protected from being rich kids, which he thinks is a negative outcome for them in his case. In the Greens case and in the Barnhart's case, they've created structures where family members can have a shot at being in the business. Usually, they're not entitled to a certain position or any of those sort of things, but they have rules around participating and getting a job in the business. So they still benefit from let's just say their application's probably going to get a harder look than the person off the street with a different last name, perhaps, or somebody who didn't marry in. But they are giving access that way, and so this might be a good time to kind of go to this sort of principle, or the basis for this. Cale.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's several principles we could talk about, but one of the principles, of course, would be, steward, not owner. So not only are, we, the call it first generation of whatever's created, the steward, not the owner, but also our kids are the stewards, not the owner of anything that they receive. And so the verse that we have that goes with this comes from Luke chapter 15, which I won't read the whole thing, but it's the story of the prodigal son. And I think, and this speaks to a couple other principles I'll share here in just a minute, but I think one of the unique things about the story of the prodigal son, and Jeff will share, I'm sure, some more stories about this, is, in the world's estate plan, we kind of had on the screen, a lot of the conversation involves, for anything that you are going to leave the kids, a big conversation about, what kind of rules and stipulations and how do you navigate kind of the control mechanisms within those trusts, which have merit and value. But just a counterpoint to that is the story of the prodigal son. Um, when the son comes to the father asking for his inheritance, the father says, "Okay, here it is." We don't know, but obviously it's a parable. But I don't think my guess is the father knew his son pretty well and knew that there was a significant potential risk there, let's call it, of what the son might do with this big windfall of money. And we know the story obviously includes that child squandering a lot of that wealth and obviously coming back at the very end. And so that if you read the Luke 15 and starting in verse 20, you'll see the return of the prodigal son. And what I always find interesting is this: the father in the story is waiting. It says he's waiting in anticipation of hopeful for the son's return. And when he does return, obviously we know the end of the story. It's a celebration and a party. And so I think what's an interesting concept here speaks to another one of our principles, which is how do we empower our kids but not control our kids? Because in the midst of talking about the estate plan and how much is enough for our kids, that's going to come up in the conversation. Is with whatever you're going to leave behind or not leave behind, is how do you communicate that? And if it's going to be a significant sum of money, should you put any control mechanisms on there? I don't think there's a one size fits all answer, but I do think that it's a good principle to consider, which is in whatever choice or decision is right for our family. Is it empowering or is it controlling? And do I want to err on the side of empowerment or err on the side of controls? A unique statistic I'll share, and I might slightly butcher this, but I know it's close. About 80% of trust beneficiaries see their trust as a burden, not a blessing. And we've seen that practically come up with kids of families of significant means. And when I say kids, I mean some of these kids could be in their 20s, some of them could be in their 40s, but they see their trust as something to navigate, eggshells to walk on, etc. More often than not, it's not a happy factor, which you kind of would think, how is that possible? If you've got, enough money to put into a trust, and shouldn't that be a big, it's a gift? I think the intention is always that it's a gift, but I think how it comes across or how it gets executed can sometimes be not what was intended. So I think it's part of this conversation that has to be addressed, which is how do we empower our kids, not control them? Just one anecdotal story is on kind of the establishment of trust, or sometimes as spouses get older, you've got decisions to make even above. Do you put these kind of spousal benefit clauses within the trusts? And there can be merit to doing that. It's kind of like you could kind of do that as a way to not have to force your kid to get a prenup later, which is another whole other conversation if they get married someday. But as a counterpoint to that, we were chatting with one family who opted, for various reasons and good reasons, not to have a lot of those control mechanisms inside the trust. And one of the commentary pieces on it was they liked the fact that their kids someday were going to have to pick a spouse, and their spouse was going to have full access to their trust. In other words, it was, and they told their kids about this early on, with the intention that their kids would pick very wisely, because whoever they married was going to have full access. So to kind of slow down and really be thoughtful about who the Lord wants them to spend their life with, and steward, be a steward alongside them. So I think the principle here as well is how do we deliver blessings to our kids? How do we make sure that these things come as blessings? And we've got some stories to share there too. But Jeff, maybe I'll pause, let you react to some of that, or share some of your own stories.
Well, I just think it's such a cool story. The prodigal son, right? I mean, why? I mean, we could spend a whole podcast on that, a webinar. I mean, so many layers, right? So many sermons have been done on, from the father's point of view, from the brother's point of view, you know, and I always the brother's point of view is pretty easy to feel like you already gave him his inheritance, he already blew it, and now you're throwing a party, like
Yeah.
and of course some of this is, a lot of this is the way God treats us. He's so generous and forgiving, and I always think of like how would we want to receive things, or how, did we want to receive things? And don't we want to be empowered? And
Yeah.
God gives us a lot of free will. And yet, what we see often in these template estate plans is a lot of controlling from the grave.
Mm,
And we're not saying all of that, all those rules are bad. It's just don't take them at face value. Maybe pray about how could you maybe lighten that burden a little bit and entrust a little bit more. And again, not formulaic, but I just think of a few things that we've seen where people have done that well. So I think these are common questions we get, like how have you seen people handle this well?
hmm
And one of the things we've seen is to not create dependency, maybe give one-time gifts um, that don't always have the annual gift, so that people start becoming dependent on it and maybe work less. But maybe you give them some money to help them buy a bigger house or something. We've seen other people who have bought a house for a couple. We had one that bought a house for a couple that when they got married, and it was their daughter getting married, and she was marrying a guy who worked for the church and didn't make a lot of money, but they couldn't even afford really the property taxes and upkeep of the house, and so kind of took away from that husband, that provider spot, and it made it kind of awkward, and so even the best of intentions,
Yeah.
you really need to think through what kind of things will happen.
And I think that brings up a really excellent point, Jeff, which can't be overstated enough, the importance of communication
Yes.
within this conversation,
Ooh.
and at appropriate ages and stages. I get that, but I think, you know, uh, historically, anyways, I think a lot of people, it's like, well, we talk about this. My wife and I talk about this, and our kids will learn about it whenever we pass. And won't they be so thankful that we leave anything behind, or whatever the case might be. And I think, well, there's statistics that show that that tends to be detrimental. But it also, I would suggest that it's imperative to even just prepare your kids, is to start talking about it sooner, rather than later. So I think there's a big conversation here about preparation of heirs. And when I say heirs, I don't necessarily mean that means they're going to get some giant sum of money, but they're your heirs nonetheless, heirs of what we call a full inheritance. We talked about this on the last podcast, but not just financial capital, the things that the assets you pass on, but also, intellectual capital, the things relational capital, the people that character capital, the virtues and values that you instill, and of course, spiritual capital, your wisdom, your faith, etc. And so, in the grand scheme of things, where do you want to be investing most of your time and attention of deploying that kind of inheritance? And I think it's hard to do that if you're not communicating. And that's probably one of the biggest, 9 out of 10 wealthy families, there's a study done, 9 out of 10 wealthy families, by the end of the third generation, all the money's gone. And the majority of the reasons not due to bad investment or something like that. Actually, 95% of it's due to, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically a breakdown of family communication, trust, or preparedness of the next generation. Um, so, an optimistic way to say that, well, therein lies the opportunity to press into what we can control, which is investing in our kids and preparing them and training them. And there's lots of different samples or ways of doing that. The other thing too, on the control piece, I was thinking of another family, or actually there's several families I could think of that, patriarch built it, it's very intentionally, brilliantly, kind of built the empire. And the empire is scattered and vast, lots of different moving pieces, etc. And is excited for getting the kids involved in that, and maybe even has a plan to communicate about that. But again, some of those intentions can die hard if you've got kids that are like, "Yeah, Dad, I'm not you. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to navigate this. I don't want the minutia of dealing with 50K ones and 12 different businesses and yada yada yada." And again, if not talked about, prepared for, thoughtfully processed, sometimes those best intentions can die hard. So
Well, so I'm going to try to keep this one. I know we went a little bit longer on the first one. We're going to try
Sure.
to maybe shorten this a little bit. And at the end of most of the podcast, even though this is more of a webinar, we always look for practical tips. And so
Hmm.
I've got sort of three questions from this webinar that I want to kind of discuss with you. So maybe this is a practical tip section, but we've got three basic questions,
Yeah.
and you're already hitting on one, and maybe you can talk about this blessing letter. But what's another practical tip? You talked about talking about the five capitals. That's a good
Mhm.
exercise to take families through.
Great
Maybe you can
exercise.
just touch on that real quick as a how do you talk about that in a family, and then what's a blessing letter? So what are a couple of practical tips for communication?
Yeah, I think tip number one obviously is make sure you and your spouse are on the same page, and that alone is a can sometimes be a tall order. But I think a great place to start is making sure you guys are on the same page. Does you know every spouse is a little different. Some people want to be more involved. Some people it's overwhelming to be involved. But I think there needs to be some semblance of there's a pathway to where someone can feel at least some motive of empowerment where I know where all the skeletons are buried, I know where everything is, and there's an understanding of kind of a unified purpose. I think is a great place to start. So making sure you're on the same page. We have an exercise for that called wealth languages. We could talk about sometime, but it's essentially kind of a way to think about your intrinsic motivation on money. And then I think a way to start on with the kids as well is you mentioned this thing on the blessing letter. But before that, the five capitals, just to emphasize that point again, I think talking with your spouse about, well, how are we investing in these five capitals with our kids? What have we done? And chances are there's more, you've done more than you think when you just say those things, like, oh man, if you're sitting there listening, thinking like, oh gosh, well, we haven't invested much in, uh, fill in the blank, relational capital. I bet you've done more than you think. You just maybe haven't been thoughtful or as intentional about it as maybe you thought you were. But it's the introduction to this community, this peer group, et cetera. People in their lives, places where they can get mentorship or accountability. But how I think that's a good question to ask is how are we investing in these five capitals? And if we've got an excess of financial capital, can that be a resource that helps us fuel these other ones? Is a great place to start. And then on the blessing letter, one of the exercises we talk about a lot is, and this kind of gets back to the empower, don't control, is with even just a standard will, you can put anything, you can attach any document you want to that will. That gets shared or read at the legal proceedings of your estate. Now we think it's to do it before this happens, but the blessing letter is just that. It's kind of like in the Old Testament where you read about these parents that like Isaac blesses his children. It's the same idea as calling out in your child what you feel you see in them, and reminding them of who you are, and what you you believe God's calling them out to be, and what your intention is in any gift that you provide, even if that gift doesn't involve any assets. It's that real narrative behind this blessing that you want to pass on, whatever encompasses that blessings. Could be all of those five capitals, if you will. We've seen that be a very powerful exercise. We always encourage actually reading that letter of blessing to your children at the appropriate ages and stages, but before an event happens that results in your passing. So those are maybe just some practical things that anyone could start doing immediately, is getting on the same page as your spouse, thinking about how you're investing in a full inheritance, and thoughtfully considering writing out what would a if I had to do this tomorrow, what how would I want my what would I how would I want to bless my child? What would I want to say? What's the narrative of that blessing I'd want to leave behind?
Well, and I think you're kind of on a track that also addresses the second question we've gotten, which is, is it's kind of a theme of two questions we often get, which is it too late if my kids are older?
Mm. Yeah.
And what if I've already did these trusts? I gave them a piece of the company. They're already getting distributions, and in a lot of cases are living on it or are going to be getting something bigger than they know that they
Sure.
could live on. is it too late? I mean, how would you? I mean, I think you've already given some good tools for that. Maybe it's just a reprise, but maybe a little counseling for those folks.
Yeah, I mean, just like anything else, I don't think it's ever too late.
Right.
I think, the later, maybe it can feel like that sometimes because there's now other obstacles or challenges to navigate, but I don't think it's ever too late to start. It's not that. Anyways, point being is I think engaging your kids in that conversation, keeping clear lines of communication, establishment of some sense of family purpose are that's a great place to start from. Even if it's just you and your spouse getting on the same page and communicating what that means to your children, your adult children that, in your mind, well, maybe it's too late. Just that can be a nice underpinning to start kind of a legacy mindset, a legacy conversation. And this isn't taking sometimes this can feel like, what I'm going to do this in a weekend, call everyone together, solve this problem. No, would not encourage that. This is like everything in life, a journey, and it's going to have its own challenges and obstacles, and every kid is different. I mean, if you're a parent, you know that your children are different. You're going to treat them differently. That's okay. And how you treat them can also be reflective on the type of inheritance that you pass along. And I don't just mean dollars and cents. I mean the full inheritance we're talking about. So I don't think it's ever too late to start. And a great place to start at any level is making sure you and your spouse are on the same page and considering how we are investing in a full inheritance. And listen, if you're sitting here and your kids are in their 50s and you're like, it's too late. I mean, well, I would just encourage you. What could you do today for your kids, or in some, maybe it's grandkids or great grandkids now, to start investing in that full inheritance? Just that alone could be a game-changing conversation.
Just like God never gives up on us, we hope and
That's
pray.
right.
We can't
That's
give up
right.
on them. Okay, and then the last question, boy, don't we get this one a lot, Cale. How do we include our kids and grandkids in our giving?
Hmm.
What are some pitfalls and practical tips, real quick, and we'll wrap it up.
Well, it's funny. I was chatting, over Easter, was with a buddy of mine, and they're on this journey right now, and their kids are young. I mean, they've got, I think their youngest is 7. I think their oldest is 13, 14. But they've already started. So they've made it. I think an important thing to communicate is more is caught and taught. So your kids, our kids, my kids, they see and learn more things from what they see than anything you or I will ever tell them to do. So I think as for my wife and I, we want to have a very open, generous heart that comes through in our kind of day to day walk with our family. We want them to see that visibly in the things we do and the things we give to, and we want to talk about it often with our kids. My kids are even younger; mine are 8 and 5. So we want to have that generosity mindset instilled as early as we can. And then over time, the friend I was just with this past weekend that has already had little giving accounts for their kids. A couple $1,000s. I mean, nothing crazy, but they talk about it. And so that's kind of the idea is they're talking with their kids about the things that they might want to give to, and why that might be. And then as a family, they've got some kind of values that they have. So when and where in doubt, they kind of rely on those values, and they're trying to encourage their kids to consider, do those values, A, that's their heritage. These are the values they were born into, but B, what are the additional values that might speak uniquely to them? So I think just little tips on starting are just starting a little, training giving account, for lack of better words, making sure that it's already a function that they're seeing as a part of, you and your spouse's life, whether that means serving, whether that means actually giving, that it's talked about on a, semi-consistent basis, so that they kind of see, they catch it more than they're taught it. And I think, if your kids are already much, much older, I think even just establishing, kind of like what you said, Jeff, on that kind of one time, even if it's just a one time, hey, we're dumping this sum of money into a donor advised fund, or whatever the vehicle mechanism might be. We want to bequeath this to you, to be generous with, and the things that God's tugging on your heartstrings to be generous with. I think is a great way to get started.
Yeah, and I think I think those are great tips early, and you and I had an interesting meeting one time with a guy who had a real passion for a particular project, and he had
Yes,
two grown children in their 40s. He was in his 70s,
yes,
and he couldn't understand why his two daughters didn't want to get involved in this thing. Well, they were busy, and I think this whole back to the empower, don't control. You know, it's okay. Sometimes the kids will express those family values in slightly different ways, and maybe giving them a little. You got to be okay with letting that happen
yes,
and just understanding they may not look at everything the exact same way you do. And this resonates with me. I think we all, as just speaking as a father, think that our kids will think the exact same way, but sometimes they think a little different. We'll express it. And if they're busy and don't want to get involved, that's okay too. So just asking them what level of involvement they
yes.
want to be, at the age appropriate and family appropriate way. How would you add on to that?
Well, I'm if it's the same person we're thinking of,
Yeah.
I'm reflecting on that story, and yeah, it's again that can be one of those things that like good intentions die hard. The dad was so excited, it was a lot of money, something he couldn't give away in his lifetime, and probably his kids couldn't give away in their lifetime, and so he was all excited, like wow, aren't they going to be so thrilled to participate in this? And then again, encouragement to talk to the kids, and he was flabbergasted by they were like to them that felt weighty, and
Yeah.
also I think because it had been talked about at least in the concept of mom and dad were generous, they were like, but that's your money, like I don't you give away your money. So not every kid's going to have this reaction, but you might be shocked at the reaction you get. You won't know until you start talking about it, start communicating about it. So that's
And maybe that's a good way to end is
exactly.
communication. And there is not a one size fits all. I hope we've made that clear. We're not trying
Mhm.
to prescribe any one thing. We're just trying to maybe point out some pitfalls and some good things other people have done so that you can pray about what the right approach is. And Cale, we'll put it in the show notes, but what's your email in case somebody's got more questions?
It's Cale, Cale dot Dowell, Dowell at arcosglobal.com, Arcos, Arkos global.com. So Cale dot
And
Dowell, easy. First name, last name, at
we'll
Arcos
put
Global.
it we'll put it in the show notes. But Cale, thanks so much for being with us.
My privilege, my privilege. Always, always a joy.
And everybody, thanks for joining us on this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. Share it with a friend, and we'll see you next week.